Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two roommates and friends since high school who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week, we're so excited. We're reading Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. Not a lot to spoil here, but if you are a person who cares about hearing the book before you read it, this is your official spoiler warning.
I'm so excited we're finally talking about this book on the podcast.
Yes.
We've only been hinting at it or blatantly saying we will be talking about this book on the podcast for this entire season. I think when we talked about what we're looking forward to this season, I was
was the book.
Invisible Women.
Yeah.
It'll come out in 3 months after I said that.
Good
but
stuff.
Here we are, and this is our second time having this conversation.
Oh boy. So we've been having some recording troubles, some recording woes. I don't know if you remember a couple episodes ago, there was a section we had to cut out because Victoria's phone was creating some interference with our audio interface and we sounded like robots. And then the last time we recorded Invisible Women, 20 minutes in, for the rest of the way on, the whole thing was messed up, the whole audio file, and I was just like, I have bad news.
Yeah. It was a time. When Julia came in, she had that look on her face of it could be anything. Someone died, or we had a guest on our last episode. I thought we lost that audio.
Yeah.
I was prepare. I know that sounds terrible that I put those two things on the same level, someone dying and losing the audio from our episode with Andy. But I was thinking a lot of really, really terrible things. But when Julia said this was the episode that got lost, while I was devastated because I was we said some, it was
a perfect episode.
We felt really confident about how we talked about this book and what we've learned through this book and being able to share it with all you listening. It was just really disappointing. But at the same time, it's of all the books, this is one that I haven't stopped talking about with my friends and family. So I'm very prepared to talk about it for another hour.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I kind of felt that too. I was of all the books that we need to re-record, this is the one that's definitely been stored in long-term memory. You know, I can recall what we said pretty easily, and I'm really excited to continue talking about it because I feel it might be a totally different conversation. That being said, the last time we recorded it, it was perfect. And now
anything you don't like about this episode, just know the first version was perfect.
Yeah.
If we skipped your favorite chapter, if we, stumble over a quote, just know it was perfect.
We nailed it the first time.
Anyways, Invisible Women. Mm-hmm. What was your experience reading this book?
So I had a blast reading this book. This was one of the rare times when I read a book after Victoria, and it's a book that she had written notes in. And so I got the rare experience of feeling what it's like to read a book after I do. It was really fun to get to... I love books that people have written in, and maybe that's really sacrilege, and you'll all come after me with pitchforks, but I find it so fun because it feels like you're reading a book with someone, and you get to see exactly how they reacted in real time while you're reading it, and you can be yeah, that part was really significant, or that is really messed up, or if someone circles something, you're man, I don't get that part. Why? I don't get why you thought that was so interesting. And it was just a lot of fun. And it was mostly just Victoria's, rage comments, which is also delightful because she doesn't get angry that often. But when she does...
It's all caps. Anger.
Just the word anger. It was so fun. I loved the tone of the book. It's so rare to find such like a well-researched, thoughtful book that also is just so salty. She has so many like personal asides where you can just see her anger just like bubbling up to the surface, or snide comments about like how ridiculous certain assumptions are. And so that was a lot of fun. And you all know that last episode I shamefully did not finish the book. I didn't finish Pachinko before we got there, but this one I was like, it's like a list of facts about one of my special interests. And I you know me and fun facts. I love that shit. So I was just gobbling it up. And it was a blast. I think I would have enjoyed more of a story arc, but there hasn't been a lot of change historically, you know? So there isn't much of an arc to tell yet. But I think there were times when it got a little repetitive because she like would literally reference the same piece of information in different chapters, and I was like, girl, you already said that. You know, so there's no sense of like time or besides that. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. How about you?
This was a book that was recommended to me by a friend, right? I think when it was like initially released, or when people just started talking about it. She sent it to me and was like, it's about women and data. I think you would like it. But basically like, well, that's you. So here you go. And so it was on my like to read list for over a year, but as many of our listeners might know, Julie and I are kind of cheap and we don't like shelling out for hardbacks.
Yeah.
So I waited for the paperback to come out, which I'm actually kind of glad about, because then this edition, the US paperback printing came out after the COVID pandemic started, whereas the hardback came out before, and so she's got an epilogue in here addressing this whole question of like the gender data gap and representation of women and invisibility of women as it pertains to the pandemic that we're living through. So I am, hindsight is 2020. I'm like, I got the better one. I got the one with like added information and like updates.
I did appreciate that. Though I will say, I felt ancient reading it because she had written it in like September 2020, I think was like her timestamp. And I was like, that was 10 years ago. Like the things that we have learned since then, and the things that she was referencing, because she made it sound like we'd been in a pandemic for so long, and we had. It had been months, but I was like, oh honey, you have no idea how long this is.
Yeah.
September 2020, like that's a lifetime ago. That's almost a year ago at this point.
That was pre-election.
Yeah! Oh my god.
In the US,
12 years ago.
That's so long. I learned pretty quickly this is not a book I could read right before bed.
Yes.
It gets me, emotionally elevated. My heart is pounding, and I have to come downstairs. Julia tends to go to bed later than I do. And I would just rant at her, even though she's completely on my side and understands, and in many cases was already quite aware of the lack of data we have around women and the implications it has on our lives. But I was like, just so that you know, there is so much unpaid labor in our economy. And she's like, it's 10:30 on a Tuesday. What are you doing? So this became a morning read. It got me fired up and ready to go for the day.
Very smart.
Yeah.
Instead of a morning jog, it's a morning read about the patriarchy. It was a lot of fun. I never knew when Victoria was gonna come downstairs. She would just sort of hover in the corner, and like all the lights would be out, and I would be playing, my shows would be on, and she'd be standing there, and I'd be like, you okay? She'd be like, I'm so angry. And then she would explain, and I'd be like, yeah, that really sucks. It was a lot of fun.
Yep. So a little background on Criado Perez. She is a best-selling and award-winning writer, broadcaster, and award-winning feminist campaigner. She is British, though she was born in Brazil. Later, when she started school, was educated in the UK. So she's worked on a handful of notable national campaigns in the UK. The first was the Women's Room Project, which I believe she started when she was in graduate school. She has multiple degrees, including one from the London School of Economics. And the project was aimed at increasing the presence of female experts in the media. There were 2 consecutive nights watching TV on the BBC where they did like in-depth reporting. One was about teenage pregnancy and one was about breast cancer, and neither of them had a single female expert brought on or interviewed. And so that kind of was her impetus to create this resource and push for journalists to diversify the gender of the people and experts they interviewed for their reporting. Other campaigns she's spearheaded, she opposed the removal of the only woman from British banknotes, other than the Queen, of course, and was able to push the Bank of England to add Jane Austen to the £10 note.
The only woman that any British man could stomach having on there, besides the Queen. Like, the Queen and Jane Austen are, like, the only venerated women in England.
Yeah. And she's quoted saying, like, not my first choice, but, like, okay, it's something. Like, we need, representation of historical female figures.
Yeah.
And then she was one of the reasons that Twitter introduced a report abuse button on tweets, and she campaigned to get the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. Her first book, Do It Like a Woman, was published in 2015, and then the book we're discussing today, Invisible Women, was initially published in 2019.
And doesn't she have one coming out later?
Yes, she is working on kind of like a follow-up book to Invisible Women. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's like a shorter, like, what do we do about it now?
Yeah.
Kind of answering a lot of the questions that she got from readers afterwards. Caroline lives in Yorkshire with her small, excitable dog, Poppy. She has degrees in English language and literature from Oxford, as well as, like I mentioned, a degree in behavioral and feminist economics from the London School of Economics. She's won lots of awards, including an OBE, where she's named OBE in 2015, which for all of our American listeners who, like me, did not know what that meant.
Yeah.
It's Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire.
Yep.
It's a very prestigious award you receive from the royal family. And, I mean, she's in her, like, I don't know, young, mid-30s. Like,
it's pretty impressive.
She's done a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And a fun fact, I told Julia she had to act surprised at my fun facts, even though it's the second time she's hearing it. Criado Perez had a short career as an opera singer.
Oh, yeah! I totally forgot!
Oh, great! I surprised you again.
Yeah! I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, reading her background and, like, all the different, like, she started school and then stopped, and she did opera. She went back. She was a non-traditional student. She, tried basically a lot of different things. She's been a writer and an activist, all this stuff. It's really encouraging when I see, like the Olivia Rodrigos of the world, like, breaking records at the age of, like, 17 or 18. And I'm like, well, I was telling my partner the other week, I'm like, yeah, I realized I passed the point of being young and famous.
Yeah.
Like, that's just not on the table for me anymore.
Right. If you become famous, it'll be, like, at a normal age to be famous.
And I'm a little bit devastated. Like, I didn't realize I was still holding on to, like, oh, I could still be young and famous.
Wow.
As I
For what?
I don't know. Something.
Okay.
Something good. Like, I'm not gonna, be famous for owning, like, the most cats in the smallest apartment or something like that.
I didn't know that was an aspiration of yours.
Me neither, until I realized I couldn't do it. I'm like,
until Olivia Rodrigo.
Well, I'm, like, nearing 26, and I'm like, I'm definitely hitting late 20s, and it's...
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, there isn't a whole lot to summarize with this book, because the title basically explains everything. Essentially, she has a premise, which is that there are a lot of gaps in the data that we have about women's experiences in the world. And the data that we do have about women we don't use. And data could mean, concrete numbers or just, like, reports of women's experiences. Before we had spreadsheets, we still had data about women's experiences. It was just whatever women would say their experience was. But essentially, we don't use women's body types, women's experience of the medical field, women's experience of various things, the size of women's hands, to design or build or make decisions about the world. That is causing very real harm to half the population when if you use a male default crash test dummy, your cars aren't actually safe for women because you've never tested the average size female body in a car ever in life. Like, some car companies just don't use them, except in the passenger seat, which is wild. Anyway, yeah, and so she takes that premise and she applies it to various aspects of life. So work and medicine and politics and like urban design and clothing design and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's kind of like just a mountain of evidence.
Yes.
For her, like...
a horde of evidence.
Like, the data we have often does not, identify gender.
Yeah.
And when it does, we don't always use it. And honestly, a lot of times people in power disregard it. Yeah.
Because they don't feel like it.
Yes. For a multitude of reasons, which we will get into.
Yeah.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there. So as we go through, we'll kind of start unpacking and defining some of these terms we're using. But when we get to the end of the book, in the afterword, Criado Perez kind of lays out like 3 areas for focus, basically, which kind of helps summarize a bunch of the book. Mm-hmm. The first is recognizing where the female bodies have been invisible, the invisibility of female bodies, which you get in the title, Invisible Women. Yeah. Whether that's missing, like Julia said, in design or medicine or research, or just like in the room at the table. Mm-hmm. Then the hypervisibility of women, which by this we mean like when women are seen, they're like, there's hyper focus on them, especially in a sexualized way, and that this leads to the harm of women that is often then not reported, not talked about, not taken seriously, going back to that idea of invisibility. And lastly, the unpaid labor of women. So we'll kind of dive into each of these 3 categories.
Yeah. You want to start with invisibility?
Yeah. So this is definitely one of those things, like once you see it, you can't not see it.
Yes. Oh my God.
All the ways that we have this quote-unquote default male. So that's the idea that society and all the things in it are built around the average male experience. Mm-hmm. Specifically, in a lot of contexts, privileged white cisgendered male experiences. Yeah. And so when we see things like, she pulls a study about how children will draw, like if they're asked to draw a picture of a scientist, when they're really young, it'll be more split how many draw like what looks like female or what looks like male when they hear the word scientist or doctor. And then as they get older, you see less and less representation of women in their drawings. And so like it's just this understanding in our culture that's socialized into us, because we don't do it initially, that, when we talk about scientists, we actually mean men. That's kind of like the bias behind it. Another example, like Julia mentioned with the crash test dummies, for a long time, most car manufacturers were only using like the average male-sized body to perform their safety tests. And so then they would say, this car is safe because the crash test dummy passed all these tests, wasn't harmed. And then they got pushback of like, why aren't there women crash test dummies? and it's kind of like, oh, that's harder, that's more money, it's different. Some caved, and so they put a smaller male size crash test dummy in the car in the passenger seat. And it's like, no, women are not just smaller men.
In the passenger seat.
In the passenger seat. Yeah. We are also drivers, and we have different anatomy and different things that will be happening. Like, this fact that seatbelts don't protect women.
So apparently, the seatbelt isn't supposed to go over your sternum, which is, like, where it has to go if you have boobs.
Yeah.
But apparently that's, like, really dangerous.
Yeah.
And apparently, like, women tend to sit too close to the dashboard because our legs are shorter. Like, we're all sitting in cars wrong, apparently. Like, you're supposed to be pushed back farther and kind of leaned back a little bit. But you'd have to have longer legs and longer feet.
Yeah.
Because, like, my feet are so small. We were talking about this. Mm-hmm. You can put your heel on the ground and move your toes back and forth.
If I'm wearing the right shoes.
If you're wearing the right shoes. Move your toes back and forth between the gas and the brake. I have to pick up my whole leg to, like, move my foot.
Yeah.
I literally wrote a note, like, how are you supposed to sit in a car?
Exactly. You know? I had that too.
Like, it didn't even occur to me that there was a specific way. It was designed a certain way so that you would sit a certain way. Like, do they even do tests for people sitting in different seating positions?
Probably only to tell us we're sitting wrong.
Like, what the hell?
That was one of my biggest takeaways from the design portion of the book, was the socialized norm for women to say, oh, it's like, my body's the problem.
Yes.
Like, oh, like, I'm not doing this right. You know, like, I'm the problem here versus this was not designed for me.
Yeah.
We were discussing when we were prepping for this episode, my partner was in the room and he was like, oh yeah, I would just, like, say, like, screw that. Like, that's not designed for, like, he's like, he doesn't run into that as often because he is the typical, like, 5'11" male body type. And he would be like, oh yeah, I would totally blame the product before I blame myself. Like, it's not my fault.
Yeah.
And Julie and I were like, oh, we've blamed ourselves many a time.
I blame myself all the time. Like, I have very, very small hands and very small ears and very small feet. Those three things are very small. I, like, complain all the time about how, like, things are, like, the way I phrase it is, my hands are too small for this. Mm-hmm. My hands are too small to hold this properly. My hands are too small, like, I can barely reach an octave on a piano, right? And I played piano for, like, 13 years. And, like, oh, my hands are too small to open this, or whatever. I don't have enough leverage. Rather than saying, oh, this is too big. Mm-hmm. This doesn't have to be this way. We could make it something else. Like, I forget that there's purpose and intentionality and design behind everything man-made. Mm-hmm. It, like, never occurred to me to think, like, oh, this was a choice someone made to make things this way for a reason. Mm-hmm. And they were probably making it for themselves. Yeah. You know? They were probably like, oh, well, what would work for me and, like, the average of the people that I know? And for a long time, that was men making that, you know, average of the men that they know. Whereas, like, there was a dude with small hands who made a smaller piano, and it was fine. Yeah. Like, because the strings are really small. Like, the way a piano works is you have strings, and then you have these little hammers that are triggered by the keys. So the size of the keys does not matter. Yeah. Because the hammer will still hit the string.
And the hammers are quite thin.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, it really does not matter. But the size of the keys was just designed for, like, a larger finger, you know? So if you have bigger fingers, it would probably be hard to use a smaller keyboard. So, and I'm just like, you could just make a different one? That was an option?
Yeah.
It blew my mind.
It makes me think, too, like, there's a lot of instruments that we make smaller ones for children. But because they're for children, the quality, you know, like, you don't want to give a child necessarily a $2,000 clarinet. That's what I played growing up. And because they may not stick with it, that's a big investment. You get them, like, the $200 one. It's smaller, it's similar, like, the holes are closer to each other, so your fingers don't have to stretch as far. We could make quality, like, high-class instruments just smaller. But, yeah, it is fascinating to think, like, this was all designed by people. Yeah. Like, this isn't just, like, organically the way that the clarinet was grown out of the ground. Like, someone sat down and figured it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the simplest version of male default, the easiest example that we can all think of is in older texts, particularly the Bible, but like in history class a lot of time too. Even like, you think of the Constitution, all men are created equal, right? Or when we say, like, mankind was created in God's image or whatever, right? Like, this phrase, like, mankind or men, like, my mother was the one who explained to me. I was like, why does it say men? I, like, pointed it out in the book. And I was like, Mom, it says men. Where are the women? And my mom was like, oh, well, that word men is used to mean mankind, like men and women, like everybody. And I was like, that's weird, but okay, I guess. Yeah. You know, and then I just, it was a head scratcher, but I just went with it. But, like, no, the creators of the Declaration of Independence. I said the Constitution the first time, didn't I? That's okay.
We learn and grow on this podcast.
We learn and grow. The writers of the Declaration of Independence, they just meant men. And they meant, like, you know, white landowning men.
But that was their default.
Their default.
Yeah, like, of course we only mean, like, they don't need to specify.
Right. And so then all these years later, we're like, oh, no, they meant everybody. But, like, no, they didn't.
No.
They just meant themselves.
Yeah.
They were talking about themselves.
I remember being told as a child to, like, whenever I came across, like, all men in the Bible, to just read it as, like, all human, like, all people.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, why doesn't it say all people then?
Yeah.
Like, this is in translation. I'm not reading the original Greek and Hebrew. Yeah. Like, we could have just there are Bible translations out there that are gender inclusive.
Oh, that's nice.
We can link in the show notes. I don't remember the name of the translation off the top of my head, but that's a great example.
She lists it in there. It's like to sort of get into the topic, and I was like, oh yeah. That was one that I accepted from a very young age. I was probably like 8 years old, you know, and I was like, oh, okay. But it's so sinister when you think about it, because it's like setting you up to be like, oh, you're not going to be directly represented. You're just going to have to put yourself in there. You're going to have to use your imagination and put yourself into whatever it is being created or talked about or whatever. You're going to have to adapt to the default. And this stuff is taught. You know what I mean? Like, someone had to explain it to me because it didn't make any sense. You know?
And going back to your statement about, like, that's not, you know, they didn't mean every person when they wrote all men are created equal. It is then a irresponsible reading of history to just tell children, like, oh no, just say all people. Like, we say all people now, we're going to assume that these writers meant all people. And in that way, not only does it, one, it forces us to, like, use our imagination to find representation. And then also, it glosses over the fact that there's, like, extreme patriarchy and misogyny happening during these times. Yeah. Like, to say, oh, they meant all men were created equal, kind of glosses over the fact that women could not vote and had no rights and could not own property. Yeah. And were basically, like, owned by their fathers, husbands, or brothers. Yeah. In history. So, yeah. It's interesting stuff. And I do that. It's interesting, too. Like, I still find myself thrown off a little bit when I'm reading something and someone says, like, I catch male default in myself, and someone's like, if a lawyer were to look at this case, she would think blah, 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 blah.
Oh my God.
And I'm always like, you got me with that, and I wish I didn't get... Why did I feel that way? Like,
I feel so called out when they do. I really love it. I love it when authors do that, when it's like someone's writing like a pamphlet, you know, or like a training module, and they just like change up the gender for fun, and you're like, whoa, you got me there. I was male defaulting again. Thank you. Yeah. But it is jarring to notice it in yourself and be like, oh, I pictured a man. Yeah. When you told me that, I pictured a man.
One anecdote that I found particularly interesting was when the first set of Unicode emojis came out. The emojis that everyone has, right. They call Unicode, so that whether you have an iOS or Android, like, you use this code and it'll display a similar design. But when they started coming out with, like, runner and, like, actions, they were all default male. And they got kind of called out on it. Yeah. And now you'll notice you have, like, all genders, which is pretty great. And they've really expanded. But the fact that, like, the very first, like, we're all coming together from all these different countries to put together this Unicode that's going to be, like, you know, universal for everyone to use, and they left out, like, half of the population.
Also, they were all white, weren't they?
They were, like, that yellow color, I think, initially, which is...
That no human is.
Yeah.
Okay. But
like
you
Lego,
showed it.
Lego white.
Lego. But, like, technically, if you want to think about it, Legos are default male, first of all. Second of all, they're default white because if there's someone with a darker skin tone, they will make it darker. So the yellow, the like neon yellow is technically white people.
Yeah.
Even though it's supposed to be not a race. But that's neither here nor there.
Lego is so default male.
Yes!
Yeah.
Yeah.
One Size Fits Men, the chapter in the book, was really eye-opening when it comes to, not only is this, like, inconvenient, we're getting, or annoying, you know, like, oh, all my Legos are men. You know, we have to use our imagination to see representation in many ways. For women of color, that's even, you know, more heightened so that they don't see themselves. It can also be dangerous when things aren't designed with women in mind. In this chapter, Criado Perez details stories of women in the military, women in construction and mining and other fields where they have uniform gear they need to wear that is not only difficult and annoying, but it can also be harmful and lead to long-term pain and even death in some cases. There was a story of a woman who was not wearing her bulletproof vest because it did not accommodate for her breasts. So
she
hips.
like couldn't move when she was wearing it.
She couldn't do her job well with it, so she didn't wear it, was shot and killed on duty. Yeah. And there's an increasing number of women in the military and in our police forces and in a lot of professions that when we can create, you know, uniforms that are actually designed for them, they can do not only their job better, but it's just fair, you know, like it's helping everyone. And a few weeks ago, I heard a news segment about, I don't know if it was one branch of the military in the US or multiple, but they changed the hair requirements for women. It used to be like a low bun if you had long hair. And they've expanded it now to include things like braids, which is not only more choices for women, but more inclusive of natural hairstyles as well for women of color, Black women specifically. And the stories of women who were interviewed was like, yeah, the bun used to like push my helmet in a way that impaired my vision. It's like, well, that's not helpful. Yeah. For many women, it caused hair loss because it was pulling their hair back tight so much, like for so long in their day, whereas the braids and more protective hairstyles are just better for the long-term health and well-being of the women. So there's like slowly and surely changes happening, but it's like 2021 and like women in the military can finally wear braids. It's like, okay, we have a ways to go.
Oh, yeah.
We've talked a lot about design. Do we want to talk about research and medicine?
Well, I feel like we've covered this a little bit in the episode on This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. I feel like she honestly might have done an even better job of explaining... Dr. Sarah E. Hill? Yes. She might have done an even better job of explaining exactly how, like, the field of academia and research is failing women and, like, all the reasons why and, like, ways that we can fix it. And the biggest one that actually does get a shout out in this book that has, like, affected my life is, like, the complete lack of research on women, autistic women, and various other ADHD, autism, and any kind of sensory sensitivity related condition all look pretty vastly different on women, not only in our brains, but also the way that we're socialized requires us to pick up some, like, masking behaviors to, like, literally hide the fact that we're not, quote-unquote, normal. And so people who are in charge of diagnosing us literally can't see it because they have been taught a very narrow and a very specific set of behaviors. And so the journey to diagnosis can be extremely difficult for women, especially because most of us either were misdiagnosed as children or it just didn't get spotted until we diagnose ourselves as adults. And then we go to doctors and be like, hello, I am autistic. Or, hey, I've been doing a lot of research on ADHD. I think I might have it. I think it might be the inattentive kind. I think it might look like this. And the doctors will go, no, you don't. You're looking at me right now. Or, they'll ask you, 3 different questions. And if you don't meet those requirements, then they'll just send you home and say, oh, no, you're bipolar. Or, oh, no, you're just anxious. Or it's all in your head. Or whatever it is. You're just looking for attention. Whatever. It's bullshit, but it's, it's a major failing of the medical industry because... the medical field, it's a major failing of the medical field because, the original research that was done to discover autism was just young white boys. And then when they created the criteria for what it is, a very narrow definition of it was officially listed. So then that's what gets passed down, right? So then any further research sort of builds on the original research. Mm-hmm. And so, that's what gets taught in schools. So then, doctors who maybe, or psychiatrists or whatever, who maybe had a class in which autism was mentioned for, a week, they got that very limited amount of information. And so, according to what they've been taught, yeah, no, I'm not autistic. But if they had done the amount of research that I have done, they would know that I am. There's a big movement among autistic women in particular, or autistic people raised as women, to just, ignore the medical system completely because it's failed us so drastically. And there's, a growing sort of online community. And then a lot of us are going into research and into medicine specifically so that we can do this shit for ourselves. That's what I'm doing. But that's the biggest one that I have become aware of over the years. And I'm like, wow, this is very bad.
Yeah. It's this trend, and I'm gonna, I don't know, I've got John Mulaney's voice, and he says, prove you're not a robot. That's prove you are in pain. And it's why do I have to prove to you that I'm in pain?
Right.
Or that this is difficult for me, or I have a hard time with these things in my life. Why is the burden on me? Not I came to you for help. Yeah. And we see that exemplified in a lot of the research that Criado Perez cites about women's pain not taken seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think she might mention it briefly in here, but we can link more resources in the show notes as far as pain of Black women specifically.
Yeah.
Black women in America have a higher chance of death after pregnancy. Mm-hmm. Or infant mortality. And a lot of this goes back to we're not listening to women, and we're not collecting the data, and we're not using the data. This goes as far back as the very initial stages of research. Often when scientists sit down to figure out a problem, they might just happen upon other things along the way that, oh, that's an interesting line of research, and you follow that. Mm-hmm. So for example, when you start with cells, you're starting just at the cellular level. You're not even testing on humans yet. They might only, in a lot of cases, use cells from a male organism. Mm-hmm. And just disregard female cells.
Yeah.
And then testing only on male animals. Yeah. So there's a lot of research on only male rats. And then when it gets to human trials, often we'll test it in men first, and if there's something interesting, we'll test it in women. Mm-hmm. But that's, again, a terrible example of male default, because there's things that would work for women that may not work for men, in the same way that there's so much medicine out there that works for men but doesn't work for women.
Yeah. The craziest examples was Viagra.
So Viagra was developed initially as a painkiller, I think.
It was something... I don't know if it was a painkiller.
It was a blood medication?
It was something totally unrelated.
Yeah. And in initial trials, they had both men and women, though proportionally a lot more men than women. Yeah. And the men were like, hey, this helps with erectile dysfunction. And they're like, really? We can monopolize on it. We can invest there because there's a market for that, and there's money, and we have stats and numbers saying this is something people want. Yeah. By people, we mean men, or people with penises.
Right.
But in those initial studies, the women reported
It was like an 80%
severe reduction
decrease
in their menstrual cramps and menstrual pain.
80%!
Which, if there was medication out there where 80% of the time women said this completely decreased or eradicated my back pain or cramps or other pain during menstruation that I have every month, that's a huge market. But there's not the data on it to prove it. They didn't follow that line of research. They didn't test it in more women. They said, oh, this works for men in this way. Yeah. And now I'm like, I think you said this the other day, Julie, you were like, I just want to see women start taking Viagra. Yeah. Being like, screw it. These cramps suck. I'm just going to try Viagra.
I want to see what happens. Because, clearly it has some sort of hormonal effect, right? Which, is tough to, always a little scary to mess with. But, it must have, I'm just so curious. I want to know, how much they changed it from that initial trial. Yeah. Would it still work? I want to know. Yeah.
She spends a lot of time talking about venture capital and I always think of Shark Tank, which is my only real experience with venture capital is watching Shark Tank. Yeah. And my mom was telling me the other day how there's a product at Target, I forget what it was, that she was excited to see on the shelves because she's like, I saw it on Shark Tank and they didn't pick it up because they said, oh, people don't want that. People aren't going to the grocery store for that. And my mom, thinking to herself, was like, I go to the grocery store. I go to Target for that. Yeah. And she's like, none of those people shop at Target. None of those people, are young mothers going to the store. I mean, my mom's, she's got older kids now. But, there's just a lack of knowledge. And then that is, exacerbated across a lot of venture capital where there's so much more money for the people with connections and the quote-unquote great ideas and lots of data to back it, which tend to be men and tend to be tools and products for men. And people who hold a lot of capital tend to be men and they want to invest in things that they think are going to work because they have their own experiences, which is valid. And women have our own experiences too. And so we want to be at the table. We want to get the capital to make products. There have been, until the period underwear, which came out, I don't know, last 10 years, there hasn't been any advancements.
College was when it, when we were in college.
Less than 10 years. Yeah. 5 or 6 years. The only advancement in menstruation products was the tampon, which came out
in the 70s or something.
Yeah, and it's 40 years of no one doing anything or putting money behind products for women when it's do you want to talk about a consistent market? Yeah.
We literally buy this shit every month. Half the population needs something every month. That's an insane amount of money.
Well, I mean, if you cut out the people who are no longer menstruating, it's less than half, but it's still a significant
quarter of the population? Yeah. Still, that's a lot of people.
I mean, we could go move on and on.
Yeah, we need to move on.
So, the second area of focus, the hypervisibility of women.
A lot of the examples of things that she brings up are the ways in which not listening to women's voices brings physical harm, sometimes even gets us killed, because existing in a woman's body, in a public space, is kind of inherently dangerous. So even though we're invisible in the data and we're invisible in the decision making, we're very visible in our bodies and sometimes are reduced exclusively to our bodies. And so 2 examples that really stood out to me of this: women in politics and nurses. There was a whole section where she talked about how dangerous it is to be a nurse. I really had no idea. She referenced research done in Canada. Basically, women, most of the women on staff, because, nursing as a field skews fairly female, and women of color in particular, most of the women that they interviewed saying that they experienced some kind of violence from patients or their families, daily. And nothing about the way the hospital was designed or the way that their standard practices and operating procedures were designed protects them at all, because they're sort of really separated. So they're often by themselves. So if they call for help, there's no one immediately nearby who can come help them. and there's no sort of protected space for, like, the nurses' stations are not protected in any way. There's no signage even that says, like, if you yell at or hurt a nurse, like, you will be prosecuted. And one of the nurses said, like, they literally have a sign that says that in the cafeteria. Like, you know, if you yell at someone on staff, like, you know, we can remove you. They don't have that for the nurses. You get a lot of women burning out, and, like, they're, you know, historically paid terribly for the amount of emotional labor that they do as well, and physical labor and all kinds of stuff, then end up retiring pretty early usually because they just can't handle it anymore. And we saw that with COVID, of, like, sort of the overtaxing and underpaying of nurses during COVID. They had just from what I've seen from, you know, individuals that I know on social media, is enough to know that nurses have been through hell the last year and a half. Hell! And a lot of them are quitting because they can't deal with it anymore. We do not... One of the suggestions was, like, designing a hospital in a circle, so that, you know, you can't... A nurse wouldn't be stranded in, like, the corner of a hospital alone at any point. Like, you know, someone across the hospital or, like, around the corner would, like, be able to see you and help. Or having them go in pairs, like, hiring more people so that there's just more backup to handle, you know, unruly patients or families or whatever. Because, like, you know, it's a space where emotions are running really high. You know, like, no one likes hospitals. No one likes being in hospitals. And, you know, if they're really angry about what's happening to them or to their families, like, a less stable person, even a fairly stable person, might take it out on whoever's nearby. A lot of times that's your nurse. And so, like, it doesn't seem like any part of the profession really takes that into consideration when designing how a nurse's job. And we need to pay them more, and we need to protect them.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was pretty jarring to me. I did not realize that.
Yeah. There was an article that Criado Perez was quoted in or wrote in the Huffington Post. She writes, "Men get attacked because they've said or done something someone doesn't like, whereas women get attacked because they're visible." And in the author's kind of campaign for Twitter to add a like report abuse button was kind of what she was talking about when she said this quote. It's frustrating that there's, like, so much, like, a woman could say anything, but just being a public figure and taking a stand on something, people attack her as a woman. She was getting rape and death threats. Like, her mental health spiraled for a while because she couldn't stand up against it, because it was just, like, an onslaught of hate and, like, really violent acts towards her, whereas other men might just receive, like, your idea sucks, not, like, as a being, I want to destroy you. It's like a whole new level of hypervisibility. And I mean, we could dig into it more. We've talked about in the podcast before when we read Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me. She has a whole essay specifically about violence against women. That when it is reported, it's just not listened to. It's like, well, what were you doing? What was the extenuating circumstances? We want answers because no person would be that terrible. Right. Instead of, like, we believe you, how can we make our world safer? She talks about the damage it does to women's bodies when we don't have access to public restrooms that not only are available and free, but are safe. She gives examples where there are public restrooms, but they're not in well-lit areas for women in developing nations, where they will just hold it in and not go to the bathroom when their body needs to, which can lead to bladder infections, urinary tract infections, and, like, really painful issues, all that stem not from the woman being in the wrong place, the woman's body being wrong. Like, that's where people want to blame it. Like, oh, why didn't she just use the restroom? It's like, no, society was not set up in a way that she felt safe because in the darkness, she is invisible. People won't know where she's at, and predators lie in wait.
The other one that really stood out to me was women in politics. She talked about how, like, we sort of see, since women have been joining politics, we sort of see a rise and fall. It sort of fluctuates, the percentage of women who are in politics, partly because of the way that, you know, the election systems are set up, and parties will tend to favor male over female candidates and all that. But also partially because the greater percentage of a governing body women take up, the more visible they are to their male counterparts, the more that they're attacked by their fellow governing body. Like the men in, you know, Parliament or Congress or whatever the more women that are there, they will be purposefully excluded. They will be sexually harassed at a higher rate. They will be more ignored on the floor, or they will not be given roles in subcommittees or things. Like, the more visible women become in government, the more that they're attacked. Whereas, like, if you have a really small percentage of women in government, there's sort of the exceptions to the rule, like, oh, you're just one of the guys or whatever. You're not. The minute there's a group of women, suddenly the men are more threatened. So then women sort of burn out because they can't be as effective because they're being collectively shut out and attacked. And so then they leave politics, and then the percentage goes down and it dies down a little bit and it starts over. So that was a bit disheartening as well.
So the third area of focus.
Yes. Unpaid labor. Take it away, girl.
So what is unpaid labor? Unpaid labor is the things that you do to take care of your house, your family, your community that you don't get paid for. A lot of people do this. A lot of parents work a lot of unpaid labor. They are not getting paid to stay up with their infant at 3 a.m. when they're crying. But that is labor. You know, when I cook my dinner and clean my apartment, I'm working, I'm not relaxing, but I'm not getting paid for it. So everyone, in ways, participates in unpaid labor. But we see a higher percentage of women take care of the unpaid labor for their families and their communities. So when we speak about unpaid labor, women are a big part of that. They account for a lot of that unpaid labor. And when it's unpaid, it also means it's uncounted in most places. One thing that was mind-boggling to me as someone who's never taken an econ class, I had no clue that the GDP is, well, it's made up, like everything is when it comes to money. But the way we said, this is how we're going to count GDP in like the 1930s when someone put this idea together, this person being a man, was, okay, what's all the work that people are getting paid for? How much are we creating in our like imports and exports and manufacturing? And they're counting up all these things, creating a number, and then using it as some sort of like metric to compare things. But when you don't count unpaid labor, it gets erased. So when there are new laws that go into effect, and she cites some specifically in the UK, which refers to like the austerity period or austerity times. I don't remember exactly what they reference that.
I don't remember either.
Time in their government. They're looking for ways to cut back on spending, which in theory is like, great, yeah, let's not spend too much when we don't need to. But what it did was cut back from a lot of social service programs that then just put a lot more work on women. But we don't count unpaid labor, so it made the GDP look good. Like, we're spending less money, and we're just as productive as always, but, like, no one's noticing the women, like, crushed by the weight of their labor they need to do and leaving the workforce because of it. I mentioned that I work with a parenting organization that provides resources to parents during the pandemic, and just reading the research and hearing from a lot of the guests that the organization has brought in to speak about how the pandemic is affecting mothers, we're seeing like a huge chunk of women who've left the workforce. And, you know, there's a lot of conversations in the US right now, specifically around unemployment benefits, and a lot of particularly Republican governors and state leaders are saying, oh, it's because we're paying people too much in unemployment, they don't want to go back to work. But it's like, wait, no, like, yeah, we started getting vaccinated in April and May, but a lot of the schools still weren't open. Childcare wasn't stable. There's still a huge chunk of people who can't go back to work or don't feel like they're in a place where they can go back to work because they don't have care for their family members. Yeah. That responsibility has been dumped on them as individuals. Mm-hmm. We also see this in a lot of, like, not only is it, it takes women out of the workforce, it reduces our income, it increases the gender pay gap, like, those things suck. And also, the unpaid labor, especially of women of color and women of lower income, it can lead to premature illness and death when they're just overworked and overexhausted. Mm-hmm. You might spend all day cleaning other people's houses, and then you go home and you clean your own house and cook for your own kids. Mm-hmm. And the average amount of leisure hours that women have is a lot less than men, especially in those lower income and minority groups. Yeah. So, yes, her chapter, if you want to learn more about, like, the GDP side of it and the implications on, like, the broader economy, A Costless Resource to Exploit is the chapter she goes into depth there. But unpaid labor is, like, a consistent theme, mm-hmm. Especially when it's like, this is such a problem. What is the answer? The answer was the unpaid labor of women. Yeah. That's how things keep rolling along.
Yeah, like... The entire economy during COVID has rested squarely on the shoulders of mothers. Like, suddenly education, childcare, and elder care, in many cases, were suddenly all on women's shoulders while they were trying to work full-time, and, like, that is madness, mm-hmm. you know? This isn't a direct quote, but one of the things she said in the book was, like, universal childcare might be the number one solution to, like, poverty and the gender pay gap. Yeah. Like, if you don't require women to do all of the childcare, to have all the childcare responsibilities, women are freed up to work whenever and wherever, and it doesn't affect their employment status.
Yeah, not only does it keep the women who were employed otherwise in the workforce, it also employs more people as child caregivers and in paid roles, mm-hmm. which childcare is predominantly a field worked by women. Mm-hmm. And so President Biden's proposal and his infrastructure plan for more childcare available, which
like
is
2 years of preschool or something?
Something like that. Yeah. Is, like, to me, like an obvious yes. Yeah, it's a like, huge, we need this. After, like, if we didn't already know that childcare is important, we have all these educational markers that kids who have, access to preschool and kindergarten at younger ages, like, develop quicker mm-hmm. and have an easier time sometimes adjusting mm-hmm. to school when they have those options available to them. Not only is it good for children, it's also good for mothers and for families when it comes to employment and payment and income. So it's really frustrating to me that it's like, everyone's like, is that infrastructure? On the Republican side, like, we think about bridges. And I'm like, okay, but infrastructure is a word we came up for. We can expand this definition. Yeah. Like, after this pandemic, haven't we all realized, like, hopefully, you would hope more people would realize America's backup plan is just women. It's not any sort of social safety nets.
One of the examples that was really frustrating was 2 different situations that were very, very similar. One was in Brazil, mm-hmm. and one was in, was it Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, where governments were building low-income housing. Basically, in Brazil and Louisiana, government was building low-income housing, and they failed to take unpaid labor into account and designed buildings and spaces that were at a really inconvenient location relative to where a lot of people worked. People, mostly women, and then also didn't take into account that a lot of the women who lived there were sort of co-parenting their kids. Like, they relied on kind of the community of people that they lived around to watch their kids while they worked. And that a lot of them looked after their elders, and so needed to live in a similar place to them. And so, at least in Brazil, the government forcibly, they chose who was going to be moved into these new communities. They were extremely isolated and separated, and people were distanced from their jobs, from their families, from their childcare, and a lot of women lost their jobs because they had been moved to this place.
And rules around having a business in your home.
Right.
Because then, it was illegal to set up a daycare in your home, but that was the most convenient place for someone to watch the kids, was in their own neighborhood. I really appreciated the example in Vienna where they talked with women and did a lot of research to understand how do women live their everyday life in a way that they had open floor apartments, units, so that the mother can be working in the kitchen and can have her eyes on her kids who might be in another room, and they open to an interior courtyard, so all the children have a play space that's kind of incubated in a way, and a lot of parents can have eyes on them. I think of my mom when we were kids. We had this big picture window that looked out to the backyard, and my parents renovated our ground floor. One was just to open it up so it'd be a bigger space, but two, my mom could be in the kitchen and look out the picture window and see us playing outside. And we had a pool in the backyard too, so it was even more imperative that she would see us if we were running around, that we wouldn't fall in the pool or do something stupid. But she could quickly be out there to reprimand us.
Things like that are so crucial. If you're not gonna pay women to take care of older people, to raise children, to have children, if you're not going to pay women to do it, at the very least, don't make it impossible for them. Another fascinating one, transportation. The way that women's unpaid labor affects the way that we travel. We're more likely, those running errands with your mom. It was a tactical...
we had a game plan.
Yes, you were okay, so we're going to go in a big circle around town. We're going to hit this shopping center because this person needs this thing, and I need to pick up this person's medication, and it's only at that pharmacy. And then we're going to make this turn, and we're going to go to this place because we need to get groceries, and we need to pick up this person from this play date. And then we're going to go over here, and it was a whole thing, and that was your Saturday, and you were sitting in the back seat with your mom while she's all right, let's move. Because it's a military operation. You gotta be super strategic about how you.
Oh, and I totally ingrained that too.
Absolutely.
As I run my errands around Chicago, I'm that was so efficient. We had 3 stops, and I made a loop, and it made sense. Yeah. And I was, maximizing my time. But so they in research they refer to it as chaining your trips. Women are more likely to have chains within their travel. Whereas men are more likely to have a traditional in and out commute. So the train system here in Chicago, train and bus situation, is a perfect example of male default design. It was designed around commerce and work, and office buildings are happening in the loop, which is what we refer to our downtown area. And there's literally a loop of the train. So there's 4 lines that go around this I don't know.
It's a very small
area. I mean, you walk 15, 20 minutes and you're on the other side of the loop. At least east-west you are. But 4 of the major train lines just go around it. The other ones go through it. Everything stops in the loop. Which is great if you work a white-collar job in an office building. Because you travel in during the day, travel out. And even then, we've got, trains run more consistently during those, high traffic times. And it's, this kind of, spider web going out. And I know I'm not the only one who's had this idea, but I'm let's just build some more, half circles that go out from the loop. A real spider web. Because then you could jump on something on the red line intersection and just follow it around in a loop, and that would be great. It would connect more of our neighborhoods. People could get around more,
because there are certain if you live on a different train line from someone, you just never see them. It's considered a long distance relationship.
Oh my gosh, my partner and I were a 45-minute commute from each other, even though we only lived 5 or 6 miles apart.
Probably less.
Yeah, probably less.
I think that's only like 3 or 4, maybe.
And then we also see disparities in the city of Chicago along racial lines, too. So the north side of the city, through redlining laws, has been historically a more white neighborhoods, sometimes exclusively white neighborhoods in the past. And there's a lot more bus lines and train lines that run on the north side compared to the south side. You get to a certain part of the city, there is one train line.
Yeah.
That goes that far south.
And also more consistent stops.
Yeah. I mean, where we live, it's like every major every major intersection up this like main corridor has a stop. And on the south side, it can be like a while. Yeah. and a true walk to get wherever you're going, which again, for women is a heightened risk when it comes to our individual security and safety.
Yeah. Yeah. So
the south side of Chicago is predominantly black in a lot of neighborhoods.
Oh, yes.
That's the racial disparity.
Yes.
Of the train lines.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, that was a lot. Can you tell we got really, this is our second time.
I'm like on the mic. I'm just, that was probably really loud for listeners, but I'm like,
this is our second
leaning forward in
time
my seat, my back is tense because I've got lots of thoughts.
Yeah. I think you talked even faster this time.
My slow down sign, for listeners out there, I have a note card that says slow down.
Yeah.
In front of me that I ignored this entire podcast episode.
Yeah. We just get so excited because, this is the kind of shit that gets us fired up. But, we didn't have anything to worry about re-recording this episode because clearly we can talk about this for 5 more hours and be fine. There's, so many more examples I have, but I think we should move on.
Yes.
Shout-outs and shutdowns.
Yes.
We had two we sort of agreed. We have one shout-out and one shutdown.
Yes. Our shout-out is the cover of the paperback version in the U.S., which...
Talk about design.
Oh, this is beautifully designed. It's designed by Rachel Wiley, and it looks like a white cover with a bunch of black figures that are like the men's restroom sign, like that symbol.
Evenly spaced
across, and red text. But when the light hits the book just right, the background is a matte white. And between the figures of men are shiny white women. So they are invisible until the light hits them right. And then you see, in between every man is a woman. There's, just as many women as men on this cover, but you can't see them.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful because when we first got this book, I didn't even notice until I was sitting on a table across the room. I was like, holy crap, Julia, look at this book cover. Yeah. Beautifully designed.
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10.
Incredible. Yeah. Someone pay her a lot of money.
I would say frame it, but then you couldn't get the light to hit it right, and you would never see the invisible women.
And then our shutdown.
Big shutdown.
Big shutdown is the complete absence of any mention of trans women in this book. She even in the introduction has sort of a caveat of there's barely any disaggregated data on women as a collective, let alone any breakdowns by sexuality or race or any of these other things. But at no point does she say anything about the complete invisibility of trans women in research, in any kind of representation, etc. And that was very frustrating because trans women are sort of doubly invisible.
It seems like a large oversight to not address it, and
huge.
She does go into the difference between sex and gender.
But she's kind of conflates the two in the end. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of the data does as well, and a lot of it's older before we started making that distinction, but she really doesn't parse out the difference between the two once she gets down into the weeds. She mentions it once at the beginning, but then throughout she's just kind of using them interchangeably. Yeah, and she doesn't mention at all whether the gender is self-reported at any point, or if it's your government gender, or if you have the option to choose your gender, or anything related to that in the data. And that's a huge oversight when you're talking about the invisibility of women in data, is we want to get all the women. Actually, I was talking to my cousin about this. She was saying, how not including trans women is sort of using the same argument that men are making, where it's like, oh, well, it's too complicated.
Right.
It takes too many resources, whatever. It's like, well, that's the reason why women haven't been included for so long. Mm-hmm. We can't turn around and do the same thing to, like, subgroups of women. Yeah. We got to do it right, you know? If we're going to get everyone, we got to get everyone. And I feel like This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, she did a much better job of sort of parsing that out and explaining, like, also what you can do about it, you know, of like, there is almost no medical research that pertains to or includes trans women. So, like, she encouraged readers to, like, kind of demand that for themselves and, like, emphasizing how incomplete the data was, even on the topic of women in general. So, yeah, that's our major gripe. If anyone makes a follow-up book, please include that.
Yes. So, recommendations for listeners who enjoyed this book and want to dig in more. My first recommendation is Caroline Criado Perez has her own newsletter that she sends out nearly weekly. It's really great. It continues to share updated research, new things that come out, as well as her snarky tone as she calls out people's BS, men's BS specifically, when they use default male things. She also has a whole section I love, which highlights products and things in society that are specifically designed with women in mind, whether it's designed by women or people who are actually collecting sex disaggregated data. Yes. After that, I mentioned Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. It's a great collection of essays. If you've ever heard the term mansplaining, she, unbeknownst to herself, kind of coined that.
Yeah.
And then, recommendation to myself, I've never actually read Roxane Gay and her feminist writing.
We need to.
We need to
put that on the show.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
Yeah. It's a major oversight on our part.
Yeah. And of course, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control by Dr. Sarah E. Hill, we've mentioned multiple times in this episode.
Yes. She's great.
We mentioned in passing, but the bulk of the book is what it sounds like, but it's an evolutionary psychologist's view. No. Psychologist? View and research around hormones. Mm-hmm. So it's just a great primer on hormones. I think every person with a body, that's everyone, should read at least that first section about hormones. Yeah. And if you are someone who's contemplating or maybe have firm decisions about whether or not you want to use birth control, it's a great read because, like, her whole premise is, like, people who have a decision on whether or not to be on birth control should know what they're getting into and know what their options are and what we do and do not know about how hormones through pills and IUDs and implants affect our bodies.
Yeah. I just have two things to add to the recommendations Victoria already said. One is a documentary, I think it's on Netflix now, called Period End of Sentence, and it's about the topic of menstruation in India in particular. And kind of trying to break taboos and inspire innovation in that field. Kind of the hidden realities of menstruating people in India. And then, we ended up mentioning, or I think I mentioned, Wanda Sykes' stand-up special last time we recorded, and I didn't this time. But, it's called Not Normal, I believe. And it's very good. I think it's also on Netflix. She talks about her experience with doctors and pain meds and stuff. Gets cited by John Oliver. But the special as a whole is excellent. She's very talented.
And then last but not least, never the least.
Never the least!
Things we are currently obsessed with.
Oh, man.
It made me giggle that you created a new list for this re-record. I'm like, your initial list never hit air because we lost that audio. But you're like, but this is what I'm into this week.
Well, I changed it a little bit. I kept one of the things from last time. But I've watched a lot of TV since the last time we recorded. So there's a new season of Master of None, written by Lena Waithe. So if you liked the Thanksgiving episode from last season, you will like this season. And it's focuses on Lena Waithe's character and her now wife and kind of the ups and downs of their relationship and there's a whole hour on IVF, which was very
interesting,
instructive, and fascinating. I don't think it's ever been done before. Like a whole dramatic episode,
That's
hour
awesome.
of television on IVF, and it's a real roller coaster. And then I'm finally watching Legend of Korra after how many years? And I'm loving it. I'm like halfway through, and it's incredible. And I also finally watched The Queen's Gambit, which everyone watched like a year ago when we first got into quarantine, and everyone was making chess references at me. I was like, what are you talking about? I finally watched it. The ending is underwhelming, but I think it's pretty excellent female autistic coded character representation. And then this band I really like called Lucy, they have a new EP called Gotcha that I listened to just today, and it's incredible.
Okay, so I have two real quick. I have been trying to find shorts that
fit a woman's
stylish,
butt.
that fit me. I have a very distinct pear shape about my body. If we want to compare ourselves to fruit. And
compare ourselves to fruit. Oh boy.
I went to REI and found a pair of shorts made by the brand Prana, Prana. They make a lot of like yoga gear, but they have some like hiking and just like all around outdoorsy stuff too. And I was so impressed. Like they fit really well. They're a little bit longer inseam, which I like for like actually doing stuff.
Yeah.
Like I have some cute shorts, but like these have 3 solid pockets, all that can fit. Like I could carry my wallet, keys, and phone without anything falling out.
Wow.
Yeah. My only complaint is that only one of the butt pockets is a real pocket.
What?
Yeah.
You need both butts.
Yeah, both cheeks deserve a pocket in my opinion, but 4 stars out of 5, they fit.
Wow.
And lastly, even though like all of quarantine we lived in the same neighborhood, I'm just like now waking up to how many of my friends also live in this neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
And like our good friend Rebecca, a friend of the podcast, our project manager, recently moved to the neighborhood too. So like the last week I've just like walked with her and we got lunch, and walked with another friend for coffee the other morning, and walked with another friend and got ice cream. He also just moved to the neighborhood, and it's like, it's not only like Chicago summer is back and like we're vaccinated and I feel more comfortable, not like, well, I saw a friend 2 weeks ago, I have to count the days until I can see another one. I've just been really enjoying hanging out with friends in my neighborhood.
Well, we did it!
We did it. At the end of the last time we recorded this episode, Julia was like, oh, by the way, this is the last one we're recording in person. And I think that's what jinxed it. I was like upset because like, I didn't realize it's our last one in person before Julia moves home and then eventually goes to grad school.
But now you're prepared.
I'm prepared for it.
Yeah. Hopefully this works and we don't have to do it a third time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!